Okay, we are excited to now kick off the next session of the Dasra Philanthropy Forum South by South. Before I call upon Vishal to just anchor the session, I want to start with a brief introduction and just set the context for the session as well. Thanks, Neelam, for showing us the way always. Okay. While we begin this session, it's important for us to, of course, highlight and acknowledge the fact that we are doing this on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, on the sidelines of the UN Climate Week. So, of course, it was important for us to speak to the climate conversation that's also happening in the global south, that's happening in India. But before I hand it over to Vishal to actually start us off with this session, I just wanted to frame it a little bit for all of you in this room, many of whom are perhaps not too familiar with the conversations around climate that are happening in India and how we at India are framing the climate conversation also happening. For many of us, I think in the West, we look at climate as an environmental problem. We look at it as a problem, as a degradation of the environment, etc. But for India, it's important for us to also look at climate in how it's a development issue, in how climate undercuts our SDGs, in how climate has actually impacted the development outcomes in countries like India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and other countries in South Asia as well. And how it's important for us to speak to climate in relation to how it impacts the other SDGs. And that's something that we've been doing in Dasra over the past 1 year to be able to bring the power of our civil society organizations into the climate conversation that's happening. The climate crisis is not something that's going to be solved just by looking at it as an adaptation and mitigation binary. It's not going to be solved by just looking at technology solutions at decarbonization, but it's going to be a conversation about what it takes to build community resilience and what it takes for CSOs to actually leverage their power and their actions to be able to empower communities. And that's something that we've been doing through the Climate Rise Alliance at Dasra, and I hope to speak about it a little more later. But over the past 1 year, we have embarked on a research with the Observer Research Foundation to really look at how are the SDGs being made vulnerable by climate impacts, and how are civil society organizations accelerating India's journey towards climate resilience. We launched that report at the T20 summit earlier this year in Mysore, and we are also now excited to bring to you the second edition of the report, where we are really double clicking on the role of climate, on the role of civil society organizations that exist on the intersection of climate and SDGs. And I'm so honored that the organizations that contributed to this research, organizations that have helped us build Climate Rise, are all part of this gathering today. And I'm really, I'm glad, I'm very keen for you to actually listen to their experiences and learn from them. To start us off, I'd like to invite Vishal. He's a director at Dasra, leads the Rebuild India Fund, and he'll be anchoring this conversation. Over to you, Vishal.
Thanks so much for that framing, Akshay. We have an amazing panel for you here. Did I sit on another mic now? Super. So I'll jump right into it and quickly invite my panelists here on stage in sort of alphabetical order. So if I could please firstly invite Harish Hande on stage, founder CEO SELCO Foundation. Thank you, Harish. Next up, we have Kuldeep Dantewadia, co-founder and CEO of Reap Benefit. Next up, we have Neelam Chibber, a very good friend. Neelam is co-founder of Industree Foundation and a lot more that people hear about. Neelam, thank you so much. And last but not least, we have Yamini Mishra, who's director of the India office for the MacArthur Foundation. Thank you, Yamini. I just realized if I hadn't done this alphabetically, we would have had a better mix of gender on stage, but not thinking quite clearly this morning. Super. So let's, I haven't really introduced you all, and I, have just mentioned your titles, and there's amazing work that you all do. So if I could, as my first question, ask you all, hopefully you all were paying attention to the framing that Akshay provided us. And the session, and for all of you all, there's a QR code. If you click on that, you will also be able to pull up the agenda online. And really, we're talking about, as Akshay said, there's a few terms when we talk about climate these days in the Indian context that keeps coming up. And for those of us who think about it more often, we sort of, assume, we take it for granted. But for a lot of others in the world at large, what Akshay was saying, this binary of adaptation, mitigation, the intersection of climate change with the SDGs, and the intersectional approach that one needs to take to make this truly a development conversation for India. These are concepts that we will unpack because they're quite heavy, right? And it's sometimes hard to actually navigate and understand what they mean. And so my first question, same question for each of y'all, and I can start with Harish and then work it that way, is just talk a little bit about, please introduce yourselves and your work in context of climate change and the sustainable development goals.
Oh, thanks for inviting, and thanks to Neera for putting this up. So, no, I think what you said is, it's become a jargon where you can play a bingo in every conference and tick off adaptation, mitigation, etc. Right? It's a play of 100 words, and we can all finish a panel. So the question is today, because what is adaptation, mitigation in Hindi or in Swahili? Doesn't mean anything. It's an English semantic that is driving the conversations, and that's exactly why there's a lack of implementation on the ground. From an India narrative, I would say, which is, because India is a paradox of a country, because you have all the problems, that means you also have all the solutions. Like the problems of Meghalaya, and the solutions what you do in Meghalaya, which is a northeastern state, is what you can easily do in Upper Tanzania. The Kenya is very mapped to central Madhya Pradesh. So India becomes an R&D for solutions from a climate perspective. Droughts in Madhya Pradesh or the floods in Upper Assam that can be replicated in Philippines. So for us, the climate is not a 2030 strategy or a 2050 strategy. Climate is today, because the amount of money or the poverty that people are going into poverty of no social nets, the farmers of Assam to Karnataka, it's something that we need to act yesterday. And so there are a lot of solutions that are coming out of the country, could easily be replicated, and that's the narrative. It's no longer an environmental game. Climate is a survival game. And I think that's the narrative in Climate Rise that we are doing with Dasra, for example. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Harish. And also, like you said, there's so many solutions coming out, and a lot of us here know about SELCO Foundation. For the groups that don't, of course, it's one of the earliest movers. But if you could just talk a little bit about the solutions that you all have actually brought to the sector.
So yeah, the foundation basically works on saying that. Unfortunately, in the energy space, we all talk about solar panels and batteries, but that's not the end game. The end game is better health, better livelihoods, better education. So it's like solar is like salt. When you eat pasta and you don't, or you eat dal, you don't talk about the salt, you talk about pasta. So that same way, energy is institutionalized into the delivery of these, and that's what we look at, is what is the nexus between health and energy, what is the nexus between education and what's the nexus between livelihoods. So we focus on how do you make a solar-powered pottery wheel, like a solar-powered rice mill, or a solar-powered a silk weaving machine, a roti rolling machine, right? Or today when I design solar for a health center, we get blamed that solar is expensive, but nobody says that the inefficiency of the autoclave is what makes it more expensive, the inefficiency of the baby warmer. So what we work on the nexus is how to make baby warmers, suction pumps more efficient so that it becomes economically viable to put solar in the remote areas and democratize the delivery of health. And that's what we focus on the ecosystem play of that, and that's the only way we believe that where the ownership is with the community and true scale up can act. That's the goal of the foundation.
Thank you so much, Harish. Kuldeep, over to you. Same question. Please talk about your work in context of climate change and the intersection with SDGs, please.
Thanks, Vishal. So, when Akshay was speaking, I think one key word he brought to the room was resilience, right? And the way we are seeing our work, or what we are doing in India, is pretty simple. How do we engage with local communities, that is citizens, and specifically young people in their communities, and how can they take hyperlocal actions? And these hyperlocal actions are actions, climate or civic actions, which they feel, see, or experience every single day. Whenever we look at, climate change and climate action, there's a very top-down view on what type of climate action is supposed to happen, or it's very, very prescriptive in nature. So the first part is, how do we get these communities to take hyperlocal climate action? It could be through local data, it could be through local solutions, it could be engaging with local government bodies. And that's the second part of our work, that when we look at climate action, we are not thinking of engaging and integrating hyperlocal political bodies, be it panchayats, be it councillors, be it corporators in our country. It's generally seen from a very, very top-down view. And our entire hypothesis is that if citizens play a role bottom-up in taking these climate actions, at one level, you are developing skills in them which are interoperable and which can be used during times of, emergency, disasters. And the second thing is, while you're developing these interoperable skills, you're also building resilient communities, because resilience has two components. It is reactive and proactive. And local communities are best placed to be reactive and proactive. So climate resilience is not this, or climate resilience is not this one big policy which will have a 10-year horizon, because when you live in these communities, you have to react to the here and now, but also need to have a future perspective. And resilience can only be built by communities, by citizens, and our specific focus is young people. So that's what we do, and that's how we are trying to add value to the Climate Rise Collective in India.
Thank you so much, Kuldeep. Neelam, over to you.
Yeah, so I have to first acknowledge Harish, my dear friend. I've always found that Harish is one of the most powerful speakers I've ever met. And Harish was also on the panel when I got selected for the World Economic Forum Schwab Foundation Award. He was on the panel that awarded me the award. Okay, so I'm a co-founder of Industree Foundation. And Industree Foundation has, over the last 30 years, worked very closely with communities around their natural resources. So I loved what the young lady before us spoke, that proximal leadership, people who are closest to the problem, which is also, I think, what the whole climate thing is about, right? So we just discovered serendipitously, it's just organic, it's grown from the work with communities, that Industree started its journey with artisans. Journey still goes on with artisans, because the globe has 1 million people who produce in their villages, 1 billion. It's global, it's not just India. Globally, we have 1 billion, we call them creative producers. It's not the right word. We are never going to get the right word. But you can't call it handicraft, handloom, artisan. They just don't fit the bill. But these are just communities who have for centuries worked with the natural resources around them, pre-industrial revolution. Then industrial revolution came, everything turned on its head, and all these people are without work, they're without any economic resilience. But you see, these natural resources are around them still. And these are very powerful carbon sinks. They are very powerful climate-oriented things. And I love the fact that this is not about adaptation, not about mitigation, but suddenly we can actually place these terms there. And what Industree tries to do is, we say, we have a wonderful acronym, ECG. In India, it stands for electrocardiogram. Yeah? So everyone has an ECG before they're having a heart attack. Yeah? So it's equity, climate, gender, right? And the women we worked with in collectives from the community up, they have always been working and building value chains, supply chains that can fit regional markets, global markets, national markets with product. It could be a banana basket for IKEA, circular supply chain, waste material. It could be a biodegradable leaf plate made by tribal village women from the sal leaves that drop from the trees, and they hand stitch them. Then they put a cardboard insert, which is globally possible by all quality checks. And you have a plate that replaces single-use plastic. So there are markets available for these communities using natural waste, natural resources. Then the third example we have is bamboo. So bamboo is the world's highest and fastest carbon sequestering plant. India doesn't have a single FSC certified bamboo plantation. Forest Stewardship Council. Bamboo is, India is the world's second largest grower of bamboo. But we import bamboo culms to make bamboo toothbrushes, because the bamboo that grows in India is useless for industrial, semi-industrial use, right? So there are so many sides of this, but the equity, climate, gender piece that we talk about is women in traceable supply chains. That's for the Western world. Women in traceable supply chains, because globally, and by the way, nationally, you can't escape it. EU norms of buying will become Indian norms of buying. So EU norms of buying are changing dramatically in the next 10 years. They're going to want traceability. And that will percolate to US norms of buying. And by the way, in 20 years, it will percolate to Indian norms of buying, right? So all our little community makers are going to be completely decimated. So we help them build collectives at scale, right? And we are taking these programs to the government of India, state rural livelihood missions. So India has a $8 billion budget at the government level for women's collectives, at village level, under the Ministry of Rural Development, and they don't know what these collectives should produce. So we are saying, let them become carbon mitigators. Let them build supply chain, which is, it can be global supply chain. So India should become the green global supply chain and take that globally to Africa and communities all over the world, Latin America. So I always give this example that pre-cotton, every community in the world had its own fabric. So the people in Mozambique wore some bark of some tree, the people in some other island wore some water hyacinth fabric, right? So we really need to go back and look at all the cultural knowledge we have and build supply chains, value chains that service markets. And by the way, in 20, 30 years, the global consumer, all these young people, the 13-year-old who started a social enterprise, these are the consumers of tomorrow. They will ask for sustainable supply chains. They will ask for community impacting value chains. And that's how industry does the intersection work. And we believe that communities need not just be recipients of climate adaptation funds, communities should be at the forefront of mitigating climate for the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Neelam. Yamini, over to you.
Really nice to be here, colleagues. I work for MacArthur Foundation. I must at the outset say that I'm very new. I've just started about a month ago, and but I see many of our partners here in the room for MacArthur Foundation climate change, climate solutions as part of our global big bets, which is something like which is a global priority. Before this, I've been doing human rights work in some very difficult terrains, from Afghanistan to Myanmar to Hong Kong. So yeah, really glad to be here and see all of you. In terms of what philanthropies can do, I was reflecting on this question, and actually, I wish I could feel very self-important and say philanthropies can do this, that, and the other, but honestly speaking, philanthropies have a very limited role to play in this regard. And the reason I say this is as follows. We know, I mean, Ankit mentioned that we are meeting around the UNGA when the SDGs are being discussed, and we know that we have probably missed the bus on SDGs. I mean, the Secretary General's report himself said that for almost 80% of the targets, we are off the mark. For 50%, the progress is slow, and on 30% of the targets, we've actually receded or stalled. And why is that so? I think the one big reason why that has happened is because SDGs required a lot of investment. The commitment from developed countries for 0.7% of the GNP going to aid, the commitments around loss and damage fund, the commitments around climate financing, none of that have been actualized. And unless and until that happens, it's going to be very difficult for us to meet the SDGs. And in that context, I would like to say that the role of foundations is actually limited. We could do a few things. We could strengthen the demand side so that all the people in the room and outside who hold governments accountable to their commitments could put a stronger voice on the table. We could support innovations like we do. Excuse me. We could support governments where we could, and at the same time support civil society. But beyond that, frankly, the role of a foundation is very limited. But I do want to mention one more thing. I think one important thing that foundations could do is stop fooling ourselves and focus on the structural issues of problems. You know, oftentimes I feel our approach becomes a bit band-aid. We are focused on solutions rather than focusing on structural issues of discrimination. And I think that has to change. One example that comes to my mind was in the past couple of years is all hoo-ha about sanitary napkins for women. As somebody who's worked on gender for many years, of course sanitary napkins for women is important, but is that the structural issue? The structural issue there is patriarchy, and we need to call that out, right? And change will not happen unless and until and change will not happen unless and until we change those power dynamics. And changing those power dynamics requires us to build strong, robust institutions which will take on these systems of oppressions head on, right? Some of the previous speakers also spoke about it, giving very small project-tied grants, getting grantees into the world of activities, outputs, outcomes, impact, output indicator, impact indicator. I feel sometimes that we will suck the energy out of our partners and not allow them to focus on the real structural issues and real power shifts which need to happen. And therefore, in terms of the role of foundation, some of the things that we are trying to do is to give more core support. We have something known as Gen Op No App, which means basically general support, no application. And I was like, really? I wish I was on the other side of the table. We are also trying to have very high standards on just imperative, the idea being that while everybody is concerned that the energy transition is not likely to be just unless and until we make concerted efforts to make it just, we ourselves need to walk the talk. So in our grant making, in our staff, in our board, how do we ourselves follow the principles that we've set out to be, and of course the conversations that have happened in the previous session around trust-based philanthropy. So I think building robust institutions is something that the foundation has probably contributed to in the past, and I hope so we'll continue to contribute to that in the future.
Thank you so much for that, Yamini. I want to stay with you for just a minute because you touched on something so important and easy to understand without sort of using fancy words like the intersectional approach and whatnot. But let's maybe use that for a minute. And you know, the report that Akshay spoke about, you know, I was going through it, and one of the chapters starts with, it talks about the myth of gender neutral climate change. To your point about patriarchy, which, you know, one can obviously, you know, the corollary to that, you can extend that logic to say, yeah, well, you know, the myth of like caste neutral or the myth of caste neutral, you know, climate change. And so it is not neutral. It is having disproportionate impacts. So just, you know, and I think this is sort of what we come to understand and talk about as why the response and the work, and as we think about supporting efforts towards resilience, has to be intersectional. So just talk about what does that mean in context, and how do you see it, maybe even an example if you might, just to drive the point home.
Yeah, that's a very important question. And in fact, when I start looking at the literature on climate and gender, I think the framework is twofold. One, that women are more vulnerable and therefore they're going to be affected more. And the second argument that I see across almost all reports is, and therefore in our solutions, we need to give women more a more central space and ensure that whatever solutions we are proposing are gender responsive. I think there is one essential fallacy in this, and that is precisely what you said, is that we are not taking an intersectional approach. And I read this brilliant report by the Swedish Institute of Sciences, which argues that while intersectionality in gender analysis is something which has permeated almost all sectors, in climate and gender, unfortunately, we are still very focused on the man versus woman dichotomy. And I think it's really important to move to an intersectional approach for some reasons. One, because it helps us understand how power is produced, and not just produced. How power is produced we can understand in other ways also, but how power is reproduced and how do we resist that? it helps us focus on systemic issues, which is what I was referring to, rather than focusing on symptoms of the problem. So say, for instance, if a Dalit girl is going to school and has to drop out for some reason, how will we ever be able to address that issue unless and until we understand that probably the pedagogy is gender insensitive? Probably she's facing discrimination on caste lines in the school, right? So I think the value add of intersectional approach is that it encourages us to focus on structural issues, the root causes of discrimination, rather than just focusing on symptoms. And I think that is a very important point that we need to bear in mind as we go along.
Thank you, Yamini. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier on in terms of like the SDGs, right, and how we're not sort of on track to achieve them, but Harish, sort of coming back to you, and again, as Neelam too said, when you were on the panel in selecting, Neelam for the award, you've been a stalwart in this space. I mean, you've been speaking about it for years. You set up SELCO Foundation in '95. At that time, I don't know what we were calling it, if the Millennium Development Goals, if it was the Millennium Development Goals or something else, and now it's a Sustainable Development Goal. So when you, like, how relevant are the goals in terms of the climate work for you, right? And this intersection of climate and SDGs, because it is in India's context, as you said, localizing it and thinking of it as an overall development question, not, as Akshay said in the beginning, only an environmental issue. And the SDGs are not always in consonance with each other, right? There's a competition there sometimes in achieving one versus the other as you think about the climate, how it intersects with them. So what's, just a little bit about your perspective on that, right? When you think about the SDGs and climate in India and climate affecting some SDGs and leading to us not achieving them or the opportunity to achieve the SDGs overall.
No, absolutely. You're in a city where you have multilaterals that are fascinated with these acronyms, right? And MDGs. I mean, so just to both of your point, I would like to know whether the SDGs will be solved first, or there is a single different photograph of a woman coming on in this room. Which will you think? All photographs, paintings are of men here. Right? When will that? SDGs will be solved faster than one photo replaced here, right? So you talk about gender inclusiveness, and in Oxford, not a single photograph or a painting in whole of this camp. I didn't see a single one. I went around and said, there has to be a change. I mean, come on, give me a break, right? It's a hypocrisy. But the question is, regarding SDGs, it's not, I think I go back to it, SDGs is, that goal is, suddenly we have put numbers to the goal, right? And what is happening is, I come back to your, if I measure the impact measurement of all the philanthropies and the grantees, it is 3 times the population of the world, right? So you're doing a health impact, the same, he's doing a housing impact, and he's doing education impact, it's the same person, but the answer is 3. This the measurement of the goal is so sadly driven as if the poor are a number. Right? The poor are, as I said, a beneficiary, right? We are the colonistic thinking we're going to help them, right? How do you reverse that and said, are we actually creating processes that will solve the poverty issues? Are we going to reach those processes? That is more important. If by 2028, 29, we are on the right track, the processes have been set up, and we will solve much of the poverty, the health, SDGs, or whatever we call it, by 2035, 40. But are the processes on track? Today, just the goals will be met or not, I'm not interested in. Is the railway track on the direction of doing it? I'm more interested in that. If the railway direct is going somewhere else, then what am I going? I mean, I hear that internally, they're coming up with the next acronym of 2030 to 2045. Why this? I mean, are we serious? I mean, of these climate works. I'm saying you 99% of the people are not serious. Let's be very clear. Put your heart on the side, and then are you putting the money that when you come for this conference next year, at least 1,000 families that you have personally said that have been impacted, then the change will happen. I'll go back to firefighting on Monday, I'll write 10 reports. I don't know where the reports go. We are not serious. If we were serious, this conference should not have been held in 2024. We are not. And that's what is, I'm here for 25 years. If I made a presentation, I did a presentation 2 years ago, what I did in 1991, and people thought it was new. So that's, I think, is iPhone has changed, but my presentation, I'm bet I will not change. So I think the seriousness is not there. I'm sorry to say serious is not there. I mean, irrespective, it's a buzzwords, it's a language, it's the think tanks. Seriousness has to be there if for implement. How many of us say that, okay, I've done implementation, and how much of us will, why does he have to difficult, how many of us will fund him? Oh, it doesn't have a tie, which I don't. Doesn't have this, he might not be serious. Until people like them are funded, let's be very serious. And he has to ask hundreds of questions to the donors. And is his PowerPoint good or his work good? Or his PowerPoint has to be better for him to be funded. That's when we need to change SDGs, and that's only when the SDGs can be met. Thank you.
So there's a call to action to get serious, but there's potentially a call to action to support Kuldeep and reap benefit as well. That's, I mean,
I just had
first
the best
Neelam on the
fundraising
panel.
pitch.
But coming next to you, Kuldeep, and you know, reap benefit. So you know, to link some of the points, right? We're talking about localized bottoms-up solution and building resilience and you know, centering sort of the communities, right, and not having a top-down approach. And reap benefit is all about, you know, thinking hard about citizenship, right, and you know, nurturing the potential of youth, you know, respecting and appreciating and supporting the power of action rooted in, you know, neighborhoods and communities, and the concept of responsible citizenship, and especially the role of youth within that, right? And y'all are you know, so you're doing so much work with youth and talking about being ninjas, right, and solvers and solving, and there's a strong climate element to that. So what are you hearing, right, when you engage these youth, and talk a little bit both about your work, but also what are you hearing bottoms up?
So, I mean, what we are hearing, and there are different Indias, so what I'm hearing is a part of what we interact with, and in that also you see a distinction, right? Like, if you look at the urban elite or the urban India, the language, the taxonomy, the criticality, the understanding of, you know, climate change and climate action is there, right? They can, I mean, every conversation when we talk about young people, the language of criticality is there, the language of how one should be integrated into the ecosystem is there, but the practice and the connectedness with the problem is very, very limited. If you look at young people, you know, especially from the urban elite. So the terminologies are understood, language is there, but just the translation of awareness into action is very, very minimal. Very, very minimal.
Give us an example.
It could just even mean politically, right? Like young people above the age of 18 would not even know how to understand how to engage at a municipal governance level, right? So the whole understanding of climate action is so top down that you need there'll be this one magic policy, and that one magic policy and a couple of EVs across all the cities in India will, you know, solve for the climate change problem. But the awareness to action, right? Like, how do I engage at a hyperlocal level? How do I see my neighborhood as a theater of change? How do I understand climate from my neighborhood perspective, and then, you know, neighborhood or area or mohalla, and then, you know, kind of expand it to the city is very, very minimal. And the attachment to their own dwelling is very, very minimal, very, very minimal. And because the attachment is so minimal, the understanding of what is happening in reality, in practicality, is quite low. And that's the urban elite. And then as we move to the rural, I mean, the issues are way more real. I mean, for them, whether it's a climate issue, whether it's a civic issue, whether it's a livelihood issue, it's all the same. And they don't necessarily have the language for it, but they have the solutions for it because they're living that problem every single day. But the problem they are facing is they do not speak the language we are so used to making people speak. They speak through their hands, they speak through their experiences, they speak through their culture. And in a way, they're feeling the pressure of, you know, kind of codifying and speaking in a language which is very palatable to people in panels and things like that, right? That's one problem. And the second problem is there is a lot of disrespect they feel, wherein there is so much so much value given to thinking, pontificating, and articulating that we have actually not given value to doing and being in your own communities. So if I'm a young girl or a boy in a village and I have indigenous knowledge and I know how to operate in that indigenous knowledge, I think the ecosystem does not respect and give them a platform. So there is this unset pressure to speak a certain language and fit in, rather than be yourself and actually be true to who you are. So that's the problem, or that's what we are sensing. So while they're actual problem solvers, they are more rooted in their surroundings. They understand the hyperlocal context, but they don't even know that they are the agents of change or they have the solution. Because there is some English-speaking guy in Bangalore who goes and talks to them, codifies what he is listening, comes and talks to a panel here, and gives an impression that I understand what is happening on the ground. But the reality is that local people have local solutions, but people top down are not willing to listen, because we want linear solutions, we need scalable solutions, and we need codified solutions. But if we reframe this, that every local solution, the process can be scalable, or the principle can be scalable, and if local people start talking to each other, my feeling is we'll have non-linear growth. Rather than looking for effectiveness, we look for efficiency, right? And that will be way better in growing. So that's the dichotomy we are seeing. So there's a part of young India which knows how to talk, and the implementation is pretty low. And there's a part of India which knows how to do, but they can't speak the language we want them to speak. And that unrest is only going to grow with time. It's not going to subside.
Neelam, one question for you, and then I'd love to open it up for the audience. I know it's right now between us and lunch, so but it looks like we're doing good here. Neelam, to linking to a little bit of what Harish was saying, what Yamini said as well, like what and then to the point Kuldeep made. Now, in the getting serious, in the business of getting serious about these things, right? Bridging the gap between rural and urban. As Kuldeep was saying, what's the role of philanthropy, South by South collaboration, international cooperation in pushing this forward? And you've navigated that space. You've engaged with foundations, collaborations globally, and I don't just mean industry. We think about Catalyst 2030 and so much more. So just tell us a little bit about what you see, right, as the role of this. In the business of getting serious, what role can international collaboration, South by South especially, play in all of that?
So there are 2 points, and I'm saying 2 because I'll forget the second one. So I'll just mention 2 and then I'll detail them. So first is ecosystem building. I think what we call it ecosystem building. Very, very fractured ecosystems out there. Hugely fractured. Number 1. And second is collaborative building. The power of collaboratives. So we started working with societal platform teams where everybody thought that this is great. Whatever happened with Aadhaar and whatever happened with the biometric. I mean, India is magical in its tech kind of thing. But there was a thought that we'll build societal platforms, but the societal platform work is kind of not moving, right? Because it's completely got to be built on collaborative work. Yeah, and collaborations are built on co-creation, because none of us is going to be able to solve this problem on our own. So I really believe that the support for collaboratives and really pushing a more collaborative way of thinking, working, and across borders, definitely. So I've said that, and obviously the only reason I became such an active member of Catalyst 2030 was because of that entire collaborative journey which we tried to do with the societal platform teams. And we realized that if you're going to impact 100 million, 500 million people in India, industry can't do it. There has to be, and it's the whole thought was built on the ecosystem. That there are, so we call it, and everybody can do this for themselves. So we just did it for ourselves. Organically, we knew that for us, our work, we have something called the 6C ecosystem, right? So construct is aggregation of people in collectives, having them move up the professional layers, managing those collectives locally, right? But they need the toolkits to do it, frankly, right? And then the next one was create, improve design. Then it's access to market, access to training, access to capital, and access to a digital framework. Because it's all about traceability, finally. Yeah? Because it has to be something which it's the first mile owns it. Yeah, and it's all self-owned platforms, right? But we knew that we needed hundreds of organizations in each of these Cs to work together on the platform. It cannot be about one organization doing capacity. Thousands you will need. You will need thousands doing create. Thousands. So how do you build these open systems? And Nikhil Gidwani is sitting there, but I told him about 6 Cs in a meeting. Yeah. He's from a tech background, and he actually started articulating the Cs for me. I met him last year at the same time here. Anyway, so I think these are the 2 key things. Yeah. We've really got to look at really fundamental frameworks and support that, the building of the pieces. We have a Target Foundation here who seeded ecosystem pieces. But it really takes a very different kind of institutional donor or philanthropist to kind of get that. Because you're going to seed something for the first time. It won't be a tried and tested model. Yeah? So that's...
yeah, time to take some risks. Okay, we have a few minutes for perhaps a couple of questions from the audience. I see a hand in the middle of the room. If we can get a mic over. Yeah, it's... we have one mic running through this, which from here looks like a sea of people, which is just amazing to see. But yes, please go ahead.
Great session, love the energy. My name is Seema Chaturvedi. I wear 2 hats. I'm founder, managing partner of an impact fund called Achieving Women Equity in Yamini. What you said resonates with us so much, because I go blue in my face telling people that we can knock out a lot of SDG goals if we invest in number 5, which is gender equity, because if you're not taking 50% of the population with you, you're really not achieving any of the other goals. I've had a very difficult time trying to convince a lot of investors, foundations, etc., who say, yeah, all of that is good, but we're very focused on climate. And we say we invest in innovation that promotes gender equity and climate action. What is your advice to a lot of, and then the second hat I wear is chair of a foundation called Achieving Women Enterprise, which is capacity building by providing for gaps that exist right now in helping a woman become economically independent, where we also see a lot of intersectionality with climate. Question for the panel is, how do we actually action this awareness that there is a strong intersectionality? I've actually been the co-lead of a organization called 2X Global at Gender and Climate, and we've struggled with this big time, even at a global level. So would welcome your view, especially Yamini's, on what you see happening and how can we promote this greater awareness that it doesn't have to be a binary decision, and it actually is a false dichotomy to say one versus the other.
Only in one bucket, yeah. Yamini, go ahead.
Why don't we take some more and then...
Oh yeah, okay, sure. So yeah, that we got that question. Let's, yeah, just for the benefit, so we remember all the questions, keep the comment part of the question short, and let's get to the questions so we can remember what they were. I see a hand close to the front of the room. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Megan Falone. Thank you very much. Great panel. Among my many hats, I've recently just been on the expert panel at the UN issuing the report that came out last week about synergies between SDG and climate action. My question is, one of the biggest bottlenecks is around finance and financing in the blended way that we all need to unlock much more work in this area. The question is, can India begin to play a role in valuing extraction? Because I think this ability to value the cost to people and planet is at the heart of unlocking some of that finance. And it seems a moment when India, Brazil, and some of the other, Kenya, as well as Mia Motley's work, are at a point where India could really play a significant role in that valuation. Any thoughts on that?
We'll stop with those 2 questions. If I can, Yamini for the first one, and then y'all can think about who wants to do the second one.
I want to have 2 quick points. On the first one, which is a quick response, I agree with you totally. I think we know from history that we have to just fight these battles. Power has to be fought, right? Nobody gives it to us. So I think on intersectionality, it's endless pushing, endless lobbying, endless advocacy, endless mobilizing, organizing on the ground, which is the only way forward, ensuring that it's at the center stage of every conversation. And I know it's going to be difficult, but that's the way it is. I just want to make 2 quick points. On the international cooperation, something that you also touched on, I strongly believe that we need to change the entire international financial landscape, the international financial architecture. Otherwise, we are not getting there. So issues of aid, issues of taxation, issues of debt, some of the African countries are so debt-ridden that they just don't have the fiscal space to be able to do anything, right? The issue of unpaid women's unpaid and underpaid work, that upholds the current international financial architecture. So unless and until we make fundamental changes in these issues, we will not be able to get where we want to get. And then the one last point, and I'll stop here. This is also the 75th year of UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I really feel that somehow the human rights conversation happens in a different silo, the environment conversation happens in a different silo, the SDG conversation happens in a different silo. But I think it has to come together, and the human rights principles of universality, indivisibility, non-discrimination are fundamental. Otherwise, we are not getting anywhere. And the human rights principle of holding states accountable for violations by non-state actors as well. We know that the big banks are investing in fossil fuel and making the quick buck out of it, not because they don't know, but because they're making money out of it, right? So I think these issues become really fundamental. And I think in the climate change sphere, this becomes all the more important because we are as strong as the weakest link amongst us.
Thank you so much, Yamini. And just anyone quickly on the second question? Yeah. Please,
sure.
Harish.
Thanks. Thanks, Megan. See, Megan, I'm a little bit concerned if we come up with another layer of financing concept. Because if you look at, if you analyze the impacts of all the critical guarantee funds that have, how much actually have gone to the ground till date? It's less than 2% of all. If you look at the bilateral funds, the multilateral funding for carbon offsets, everything has minuscule. Definitely India can actually take the role of, because if you look at social banking, India was the first, it has, no other country actually has, in the developing world, has more than 50,000 banks in rural India financing asset-based financing, right? That needs to be replicated, and not about microfinance. How does long-term asset financing actually happen in Africa, right? So when we talk about Africa, we suddenly talk about, okay, subsidies are bad, but you know, which is the largest not-for-profit in the world? Not-for-profit. It's Uber. Will never make money. It is. Think of it. It will never make money. It loses more. And then investment. But when you come to Sierra Leone, oh, that's a subsidy. Oh, we cannot do it, right? My question is, JFK never makes money, the airports. None of the airports in the world make money. None of the roads make money. It's a public asset that is done for the development of a country. Now let's look at development of the world. If development of the world has to be done, long-term, asset-based, low-interest financing has to go into Africa and the developing world, and no more hiding behind the facts of, oh, carbon offset, climate, impact. Straight, simple 18th century financing, low cost for the poor to develop. Because you get married into that, ultimately money does not go. So it's a great idea, but I'm a little bit jaded by the jargons, and again it will be top down and it will hardly ever reach the people that we have to reach. So let's go back to simplicity of the 18th century and get the financing, just that the Industrial Revolution did, get the financing to Africa and India.
And not see it as a subsidy. Thank you so much. With that, we come to the close of the panel.